I'm VJ Hamilton and welcome to the Autoimmune Reset, the place for you to learn how to thrive with autoimmune disease and feel empowered to take steps to transform your health to feel better than ever. You can start making changes today to improve your health. So with every episode, my mission is to share with you simple ways to up-level your diet and lifestyle with key learnings from my own journey reversing autoimmune disease and inspirational stories from those who have reset their autoimmune symptoms and are now thriving in life. I suffered from autoimmune disease for over 25 years and now I live symptom-free, and I wish the same for you as well. So thank you for being here and sharing this time with me. Now let's get started. Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Autoimmune Reset podcast. I'm your host, VJ Hamilton. I'm a nutritionist, scientist, and expert in autoimmune disease. And today I want to talk to you about the link between irritable bowel syndrome and autoimmune disease, but also looking at the underlying root causes of irritable bowel syndrome, which is often referred to as IBS, and I will be referring to it as that throughout the episode. I have many people who come to me and they will tell me that they were diagnosed with IBS, say 10 years ago. And it seems to be a common theme that I keep seeing is that people are diagnosed with IBS, and really that doesn't mean much when it comes to being able to do something about it. And then years later, they develop other symptoms which seem unrelated to IBS. But from my perspective, it is very much the start of the development of these chronic illnesses that they end up with. So it's important with any symptom that you get ahead with it. But when it comes to IBS, it can be quite frustrating, as it was for me when I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, because it doesn't tell you exactly what has caused that condition, and you need to know what has caused your condition to be able to address it. So today, that's what I'm going to be sharing with you. So if you are somebody who is struggling with a gut issue, an inflammation, or you've been diagnosed with IBS or know somebody else that has been, then this episode is for you. And today I want to talk to you about a study that was written by Benjamin Brown, which I often refer to when I'm working with clients who have IBS. It's a great paper. It's called Does Irritable Bowel Syndrome Exist? Identifiable and treatable causes of associated symptoms suggest it may not. And I really love this article. I'm going to link to it in the show notes because it goes through the potential root causes of IBS, because IBS is just telling you a symptom almost. It's just that when you have IBS, you may experience bloating, you may experience inconsistency with your bowel habits, you may have abdominal pain, and these are all symptoms of IBS, and that's why you get diagnosed with IBS, but that doesn't tell you why you have IBS. And that's why when I'm working with clients and they have an autoimmune condition and they have gut issues as well, we'll often run a stool test, because by understanding what's going on in their gut, we can then get to a point of knowing what is the underlying root cause of their symptoms, and then we can address that head on, and that can really help them, not just with their IBS, but with the autoimmune symptoms as well, because an autoimmune condition is often started with inflammation, and that inflammation is normally or typically triggered by issues in the gut. And one of those issues could be related to their IBS diagnosis. As you know, when I see a pattern in my clinic, I want to know more. And this is a pattern that I've been seeing time and time again, which is why I wanted to share it with you today. So I'm going to be going through the potential root causes based on Ben Brown's article, and I'm just going to go through them in a bit more detail so you understand the relevance, but there are quite a few to get through, so I'm going to do my best to get through them quickly. We're going to start with lifestyle and environmental factors that can contribute to IBS, and the first one is probably not going to be any surprise to you, but it relates to stress, because when you are stressed, you're more likely to be anxious or depressed, and they're two clinical features that they see quite often in IBS. We know that there is this link between the gut and the brain. We have the vagal nerve, but not just that. There are neurotransmitters that are made in the gut, and there is this bi-directional communication between both the gut and the brain. And when you're stressed, the truth is your body is not focusing on digestion, and that's why you can end up with issues such as IBS when you are in a more stressed state. And the reason this is important is because if you have IBS and you think stress might be one of the root causes or the root cause of your IBS, then rather than just focusing on the gut, you're going to want to focus on the stress response as well. And there is a test that you can do to look at your cortisol levels, because what I find is that people may not realize they're stressed, and I was certainly guilty of it. I was working at a very high-paced environment at work, and I was socializing on a night, and I was going to a Barry's boot camp or some kind of exercise class in the morning, and sometimes I'd go for a run after work as well. And I was doing just a lot. And when somebody asked me whether I was stressed, I just said no. I just didn't think I was stressed because this was just such a normal feeling for me. But the truth was I was massively stressed at that point. I think I do like to live at a certain stress level, but I'm working on it every day to bring that down, and I use my Oura ring to help me understand how stressed I've been in a day, and it is gradually coming down. But I look back to 10 years ago and I was probably more stressed than I realised. Well, I'm sure I was. And it was only when I worked with a life coach and, she helped me to see that I was actually just in a very stressed state. And that's why doing some testing around your cortisol levels can give you a good indication of what stress levels you're operating at the moment. And I find with my autoimmune clients that they either have very high stress and very high cortisol. I think that's at the beginning when you are in a chronic stress state, but then what can happen over time is that you just end up with a very low amount of cortisol and you are almost just done. And there are different therapies dependent on where you are, but both can be linked to IBS. The next root cause can be circadian rhythm disruptions, because your body works on this biological clock, so it knows when to do things at a certain time. And the best habit to be in when it comes to your bowel habits is to be going to the toilet at the same times each day, and your body will just get used to that. And one of the things that I would suggest for somebody who has constipation, obviously there's a lot of dietary recommendations that I provide as well, but is to go and sit on the toilet at a certain time in the day and just see if something happens and get into that habit of doing that. And that can be helpful because when your circadian rhythm is off, it can also cause issues in your gut, which can then lead to these IBS symptoms. So if you find that you are not in a regular sleep pattern and you are having these symptoms of IBS, then that potentially is something to work on. The next is physical activity. And we know when it comes to your health, it is important to be moving and to be physically active. But this is even more important for our digestive health because it just keeps things moving. And sometimes one of the problems with IBS is that the food is not moving through the digestive tract quick enough. So it's just sitting there, and you can do your colon transit time. This is something that I will often recommend my clients do because it just gives me a bit more insight into actually what's going on. And the colon transit time will tell you how quickly food is moving through. So the time that you eat some food and the time that it comes out the other end. And a great way to do that is just by having some sweet corn, because sweet corn doesn't digest. So if you have some sweet corn and then time how long it takes for that to move through your bowels, it's going to give you a good indication of your colon transit time. And if that is slow, then it means that bacteria are likely to overgrow. It means that you might reabsorb certain toxins into your body. So there are a lot of things that you can think about when it comes to understanding your colon transit time, but also making sure that you are moving. That can help with this transit time, and it can just help generally with your psychological symptoms as well, because we know when we exercise we feel more positive, and that can have a knock-on effect to our gut as well. So now let's talk about nutrition factors. And if you've had IBS, or if you have IBS, you may have been recommended to follow a low FODMAP diet. And that is when you take out these fermentable carbohydrates, which can feed certain bacteria in the gut. And for example, with something like ankylosing spondylitis, there is a low starch diet recommended for that condition. And the reason for that is that starches will feed a certain type of bacteria called Klebsiella, and Klebsiella is known to trigger the autoimmune reaction in ankylosing spondylitis. So that's the reason for that recommendation. And it's the same with IBS, that if you have a buildup of certain bacteria and you are feeding that bacteria, then you're going to have symptoms that are related to an overgrowth of that particular bacteria. And this is why it's going to be different for everyone. I find some people do a low FODMAP diet and it works really well for them, and other people it just has no impact at all. And it does depend on your gut bacteria makeup and how that responds to these types of carbohydrates. But lowering these high FODMAP foods can help, and it can especially help in the short term. I find for some people it doesn't get to the root cause of the issue, so you don't want to be on a low FODMAP diet for the whole of your life if you can avoid that, because there are lots of beneficial foods that are higher FODMAP. But it really depends what's going on in your gut. And if you do find relief by following a low FODMAP diet, then that is the best thing to do in that moment. But finding ways to address those underlying imbalances that might be contributing to that is important and can help with IBS symptoms. Next is lactose intolerance. So lactose intolerance is a little bit different to a dairy food sensitivity, and it relates more to the way that you are able to digest lactose. And lactose is a component of dairy, and it's found in milk, in cheese, in yogurts. And some people may not produce enough lactase, which is the enzyme that helps break down lactose. And because you're not breaking down the lactose, which is a fairly large molecule that comes from milk, and if lactose is not broken down appropriately, then it can cause disruption in the gut. And there has been a study that suggests that it can also activate the immune system. So as much as it's to do with the fact that your body isn't able to break down the lactose molecule itself, it then has a knock-on effect, and that's when it can stimulate an immune response, because it hasn't been broken down, so it doesn't look like your immune system would expect it to look like. So it fires up an inflammatory response as a result of that. And they have shown in studies that people with IBS are more likely to be lactose intolerant. And you can do a genetics test which shows whether you have a genetic variation in the gene that codes for the enzyme that helps break down lactose. So that's a really good starting point. I always thought that I was lactose intolerant, but I did lots of testing around this, including food sensitivity testing, and I didn't seem to have a problem, but it might have been that I wasn't breaking it down properly for other reasons. And that can be to do with the gut bacteria that you have, and many of the factors potentially, being stressed, and that may have impacted me, and that's why they assumed that I was lactose intolerant. But it's certainly one to look into if you have IBS. The next is food hypersensitivity. So having a food sensitivity, which is distinct from an allergy, which is more immunoglobulin E, IgE, whereas we're looking more at the IgG response to food, which is also an antibody response, but it's not normally as noticeable when you first ingest the food, and that can be quite frustrating because you might not know you have a reaction to this food because you might feel the IBS symptoms days later, even though you had the food 2 days earlier. So it's quite hard to track. I work with my clients by helping them to track the food they're eating, track their symptoms, and then we look for patterns to help us determine what they might be reacting to and what might be causing their digestive symptoms. But you can also do testing around this as well. But there have been some studies to show that elevated serum IgG antibodies are associated with IBS, and it may be a factor for some people, so it's worth ruling that out. Next is non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is characterized by intestinal symptoms related to ingesting gluten, but it's not celiac disease, which is a different manifestation of a gluten reaction. And it's always worth making that distinction because there are different mechanisms involved. But non-celiac gluten sensitivity has been associated with IBS, especially diarrhea predominant IBS, but as I said, without celiac disease. And one of the ways that you can look into this yourself is to think about taking gluten out of your diet and seeing if your symptoms improve. And because these reactions are not always as obvious, it is best to take gluten completely out of the diet rather than moderating it to really see whether you are having results by taking gluten out of the diet. But there is a link there with non-celiac gluten sensitivity and IBS. Next is to do with the sensitivity to dietary nickel, because you can find nickel in certain foods. And what you may find is if you react to nickel when it's in jewelry, you may have an issue with nickel containing foods as well, and that can cause IBS symptoms. So again, you can look into nickel rich foods, see if they're the types of foods that you're more likely to react to, and if you take them out of the diet or you decrease them significantly and your IBS symptoms improve, then it might be that you have been reacting to nickel rather than anything else going on in the gut. And I would say this is probably more likely in somebody that has a reaction to nickel in jewelry. I always had a reaction to nickel in jewelry, so I'm sure this was a factor for me as well. But it's worth looking into if you have that reaction to nickel and you think you might be reacting to nickel rich foods. And if you would like to find out more about that, then feel free to message me because I have a list of nickel-rich foods that you can take out if you want to learn more about that. The next one is a vitamin D deficiency, and they have found that children and adults with IBS have a higher prevalence of vitamin D deficiency compared to those who don't have IBS. And we know how important vitamin D is in keeping the immune system in sync and keeping it tolerant and making sure that you don't have inflammation at the gut barrier. And that may be a reason for this, because when that's off, it just means that your body is going to be more reactive to more things, and that can lead to IBS symptoms. Next, let's look at functional imbalances. So exocrine pancreatic insufficiency is linked to IBS, and that's when you're not able to produce as much pancreatic elastase to help break down protein-rich and carbohydrate-rich foods. And you can see again, similar to lactose, if you're not breaking down foods appropriately, then that can cause issues in the gut. And studies have shown that there is a higher prevalence of pancreatic insufficiency in those with IBS. And then it's just for you to understand why you have pancreatic insufficiency in the first place. And that might be something that you work with your doctor on, or you can also consider taking enzymes to help with that. I will check this in the stool test that I run, the GI effects. It checks for this. And if we find that pancreatic elastase is low, then it's understanding what could be causing that. And there are numerous factors that can cause it, like low stomach acid, because there is a feedback loop. It might be something going on with the pancreas, and it could be to do with having imbalances in gut bacteria as well. So it's just worth looking into that. Next is low-grade inflammation. So you may have had your C-reactive protein checked or calprotectin, and they are slightly raised, but not enough for you to be diagnosed with inflammatory bowel disease, because inflammatory bowel disease is often mixed up with IBS because they may have similar presentations to start with. But this is a distinctive factor in the sense that inflammatory bowel disease will have this extreme inflammatory component to it and far more extreme symptoms for the most part. But you may have slight inflammation with IBS, and that might be the reason that you are having IBS symptoms. And studies have shown that when somebody with IBS eats more anti-inflammatory foods or takes anti-inflammatory supplements like boswellia, that their IBS improves. So I always think this, when you have a condition and, for example, you take a supplement to help with that, or you even take medication to help with that, and it improves, it gives you information of what the cause was. Because if it's improving through that supplement or through that medication, well, what does that supplement do? And if it's having anti-inflammatory effects, then you know inflammation has been a key driver in your symptoms. That's what this study has shown. But it's not going to be for everybody, but for some people, inflammation will be at the heart of their IBS. Next is intestinal permeability, which we know is often referred to as leaky gut syndrome. And because the intestinal barrier is impaired, it can mean that it is more likely that viruses, bacteria, and dietary and environmental toxins can enter into the bloodstream, but that can also cause an inflammatory reaction at the intestinal barrier as well. And that can lead to these symptoms of IBS. And if this is an underlying factor for you, it might be that you have digestive symptoms, but you also have these systemic symptoms as well, like issues with your skin, or you may have fatigue, or you might experience brain fog, or you might find that your joints hurt. And if you're seeing that link, then I would always think about the intestinal barrier and whether you have increased intestinal permeability, because that is likely a factor, especially if you're getting gut issues and then you get these systemic symptoms at the same time. And we know that there is this link between migraines and our gut. And I know people who know a migraine is coming because they have indigestion problems, or they have issues going on in their gut, they have abdominal pain, and due to that they know a migraine is coming, and that just shows how interlinked it all is. Next is bile acid, and bile helps to break down fats that we eat. When there is a disruption in the amount of bile that you're producing, or the gallbladder has become sluggish, then you're more likely to have fat in your stool. But that can also cause an issue with the digestive process, because if you're not breaking down fats appropriately, then you're going to have more fats in the digestive system. That means that you can produce more of a toxin called lipopolysaccharide, which is more likely to be present if you have a high growth of gram-negative bacteria. And again, that's what can be tested for on a stool test, to understand whether you have a high amount of gram negative bacteria. And if you do, you're more likely to create this toxin called lipopolysaccharide. On top of that, if you have an issue digesting fats, that's just adding fuel to the fire, and that's what can then lead to these IBS symptoms. The other issue that you can have is chronic constipation, and chronic constipation may mimic IBS symptoms because we know with IBS that one of the symptoms is chronic constipation, but it is best to understand which you have, because again, the treatment options are going to be different depending on what they are. And if constipation is driving it, then you may find that bringing in a prokinetic type treatment, you can also have prokinetic herbs that you can add. Ginger is a really great one for that. And you can add those to your diet, and that may improve your symptoms as well, and that's going to help with colon transit time too. The next is dysbiosis, and I see dysbiosis, I would say, in about 80% of my clients, if not more. And dysbiosis is where you have an imbalance of gut bacteria in the gut, and that can lead to things like intestinal permeability and inflammation. So this can be a root cause of IBS, and by harmonizing the gut bacteria, making sure that you have sufficient growth of some of these key bacteria, which we know are so helpful in the digestion of food and keeping the immune system in check and keeping everything moving in the digestive tract. And when they're not there, that is going to lead to symptoms. So when it comes to IBS, when you have dysbiosis and you have an imbalance of gut bacteria, then that can lead to IBS symptoms. I want to touch on small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, I would say again with small bacterial intestinal overgrowth, which is where you have a growth of bacteria in the small intestines when it shouldn't be there, isn't really telling you the whole picture. So it is helpful to know if you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and there are breath tests that you can do, and also as part of the stool test, it will help identify certain bacteria in the gut that are more likely to release these gases which are associated with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. But it doesn't always tell you the underlying cause of that, and that might need to be explored further. They have shown that those with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth are more likely to have IBS and IBS symptoms, and that makes sense. If you have bacteria growing in the wrong place and you eat certain foods that ferment and cause those gases to be released, you are going to be in pain, you are going to bloat, and they are all symptoms associated with IBS. And then we have parasitic infections, and again, these come up quite often in my clinic, and more often than the general population, and that's probably because I'm working with people with chronic illness and autoimmune disease. Parasites may be helpful for our health. There have been studies and reports that we have this synergistic relationship with certain parasites and they can help us in certain situations. But ordinarily, if I'm seeing a high growth of blastocystis or some of the other more common parasites, and they are in high growth, then for me as a clinician, if they are having symptoms associated with that parasite or they have digestive issues, then we are going to work on eradicating that. And there are various ways that you can do that. And it really depends on the parasite and depends on where my client's health is currently at and other things that are going on in their gut as well. But there have been studies to show that blastocystis is linked to IBS symptoms. So I'll do a full health assessment when I'm working with my clients to understand what is going on in their gut. But then if I find that blastocystis is present when we do a stool test, then we need to eradicate that, because that is probably at the heart of their IBS symptoms. And as I said at the beginning, when it comes to an autoimmune condition, I find that my clients will be diagnosed with IBS first. And if it is the parasite that is causing that IBS, then we work on the parasite. That helps with the IBS, and that's going to help with their autoimmune condition as well. And that's the process I like to go through. I like to kind of keep digging. Why is my client now experiencing hair loss. Okay, so what happened? They got diagnosed with IBS before the hair loss. Okay, so what happened when they had the IBS diagnosis? They went on a trip away. Okay, so what's the stool test revealing? Okay, it's revealing blastocystis. Right, now we're getting somewhere, because that is probably at the root of their issues. Because if you think about it, they have a parasite, they have IBS, they have these symptoms, they're then likely to develop nutrient deficiencies because the digestion isn't working as well as it should do. Plus they've got inflammation that can trigger an autoimmune condition, especially if those autoantibodies are present. That can happen through a concept called molecular mimicry, that can happen through leaky gut syndrome. And I'm just pulling all these pieces together and thinking to myself, what is the easiest way that we can make the biggest difference? And if I find a parasite, that can be one of the easiest ways, because we are removing the root of the issue. And at the same time, we can then work on the inflammatory aspect, we can work on repopulating their gut, we can work on other areas to really help them with their symptoms, depending on what their symptoms are. And that's certainly what I did. I spent years focusing on finding ways to grow my hair back to help to relieve my symptoms of psoriasis that are on my skin, or finding a quick fix when it came to energy. And that just didn't help me in the long run. I had to go back to basics. I had to start looking at what is going on in my gut. What nutrient deficiencies do I have? What is going on with my cellular health? Where are my hormones at? And then by working on those factors step by step, that's how I was able to reverse my symptoms. And I surprised myself with it, because I didn't really focus on those symptoms as I was getting better. I just focused on the underlying imbalances, and I just took a step-by-step approach. And that's how I like to work with my clients. I explain why we're doing things, and then we just take it a step at a time. And honestly, that is the best approach for all of us in the long run. And you do need a bit of patience, but once you get there, hopefully there is no going back. And that's the thing with an autoimmune condition. You want to get your body to a place that it is robust enough to get through most things. And we don't know what life is going to throw at us. And it might not always be that straightforward, especially if we go through a hugely stressful event or grief or something that just throws us completely out. But for the most part, we need to be able to move through our lives knowing that we have this susceptibility to autoimmunity, but that we know that our body is in a strong enough state to get through it without going into a flare. So I hope you found today's episode helpful. Do any of these resonate with you? If so, pop over to my Instagram account and let me know. You can send me a direct message over there, or you can join my free group, which is called the Autoimmune Forum. I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions about anything that I've gone through today, or you think one of these might be the underlying root cause of your IBS or your autoimmune condition, feel free to come over and share that and ask questions around that if you'd like to. And if you would like to work with me one-to-one, I do run a virtual clinic, the Autoimmunity Nutritionist. I work with clients all over the world. I work with clients in the US, in Europe, in the UK, in Australia. And, I've traveled all my life, and I love working with people all around the world and seeing them improve their health, even though we're only meeting over Zoom. It's incredible the results that people can have. So if you would like to find out more about working with me one-to-one, then you can book a free consultation with me. You will find the link to that in the show notes. You can also run functional testing in different locations around the world, and I am linked in to different laboratories there. So if you would like to find out more about what I do and how I might be able to help you, then feel free to book a free call, or I'll put the link so that you can learn more about the services that I offer. If not, have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll be in touch soon. Take care. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Autoimmune Reset. I really hope you enjoyed the discussion, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. And if you liked it, I would hugely appreciate a review on iTunes, as it helps me understand what you like about the podcast and to help share the information with more people. I'm excited to speak to you next time, and remember, You have the power to take the reins on your health. So keep the faith and celebrate the small wins. Until next time.